It's, a- Hi, Zara. I have not been communicating very well. I apologize. We met with Allison really early this morning. Um,
Oh,
but we've just, like, I found it really hard to also organize things.
In the audio settings, can you go to the audio, bottom left to the audio, little down arrow? Question,
This one?
yeah. That should be a loud one.
Okay. So then I would not mute myself.
I don't know if it uses your mic, or no, it uses the system.
It seemed like it was,
That little thing on it.
oh, and this is muted. So if I turn it on?
Yeah, so
Hmm.
now you don't need yours.
Okay. Oh, no, but isn't it connected to mine? Like if I close my mute button, or if I turn on my mute button,
It'll turn mute the whole thing.
I think it won't allow this input to go through my computer.
Let's test it. Zara, can you hear us?
Yes.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Zara, can you hear me? Okay. That worked. Now, mute yours.
Wait, I have to do something
You do
else.
what you have to do.
Okay, I can mute mine. Because I think this is just controlling the flow of electrons from. Okay. Connect to the network. Is it easy to connect to Yale guest?
Yeah, just a guess, but then you have to go to a browser to say I accept and agree to all
Okay,
of the
that's okay. I
conditions.
can do that.
You could even connect the tablet to this thing if you want.
It is too complicated right now.
Mhm.
Yale's guest. Thank you for your interest. This is not a public network. I agree.
And you like my, but welcome.
I agree. I will pay Yale. I will respond to the alumni emails. I can't, the last one that came to me didn't even have an unsubscribe button.
I will formally admit regret for not having continued my Yale education.
No, not at all. That would have not worked very well. Okay, and then I make you.
Is that
a-
your tablet?
Yeah,
Hey,
good co-host. And close my email. And then,
The upper coming. And what is the Cheetos? I don't know these are. Really?
they're good. They're good enough. They like a little bit spicy. They're not very spicy though.
Yeah, I've seen these.
Fingers are gonna be orange for the next 3 weeks.
Oh, no. No, thank
No.
you.
No, it's not that exciting.
Okay, I'm enabling for sharing. So you can,
There's definitely something. Thank you.
okay, here, you can comment on this, but you can now see it up there. So Kartik can. I wanted to put it up so both of you could see it. Quick, I'm home in case I got hungry, but I didn't, so I'll leave them to. I don't know what I did with my water bottle. I hope I didn't lose it.
You bring it this morning, or?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with it, you have.
I filled it this morning. Okay, keep going. So I think down at the bottom is where we're not agreed yet. Or not, just not sorted.
Oh, I see. Yeah, right. But I do see. I would put clothing in a different place. So,
Mhm.
yeah. But that doesn't matter. It's just within the satisfying domain.
Yeah, I think I'm not clear on whether or how we divide between satisfiers and ways of achieving.
But what do you mean by ways of achieving? Because satisfiers are what you need to achieve. I mean, the thing is, if you measure environmental temperature, relative humidity, and draftiness as a proxy for body temperature, you're missing exactly the whole point about adaptive comfort.
I understand.
You get with clothes.
Uh-huh. I actually think that some of our problem is addressed by the objective to by the 5 buckets there.
Well, that's a proxy.
Mm-hmm.
It's a proxy for the maintained body temperature. But again, like
I
you
agree.
said, that depends on where you are. Make sure to be careful. What are you
Mhm.
interested in? You know, people indicate what
Yeah.
uncomfortable enough to take action. Which
Mm-hmm.
one do you care about? But anyway, I would only
Your point about proxies is a good one. We may need to unpack that.
about which one?
Well, so I think when we get down to, like below here is where I laid out the objective to subjective. Or objective to quality of life, the 5 steps. And I think that they're still kind of bound, that we still haven't unpacked this bottom part in terms of that.
I don't think we should go there today.
No, maybe not, but I'm saying that I
Yeah.
think that's where. I think that some of that is potentially fixable.
Maybe. I mean, this entire thing is intended to be objective and normative in the sense that these are universal things. To some extent, people will differ, of course, across the entire spectrum, even which capabilities matter, right? Even the central capabilities, society needs to prepare for them, but that doesn't mean everybody will put equal importance on all of those capabilities. So there is subjectivity through the entire framework. Oh, yeah, I wouldn't bring that in the way we were discussing it earlier. So, okay, we're gonna talk through this, where do you want me to,
Yeah,
let me know what you want me to do.
well, I wanted to give, hello, everyone. Hello, hello. Um. See,
Can somebody say something so we know that the speaker is working?
Hi, Tammy. Hi, Narsi.
Great, thank you.
um. hmm. Okay, well, Narasimha, Kartik and I are in a room. A small room. At Yale. And, oh, I guess you guys are all logged on, okay. And we've been talking about well-being for a while. Ellison is gonna be late, she said.
Okay.
And, okay, so let me just say first that probably some requests around what we have to prepare for for NSF some more even will be coming to you. I feel like there's a lot of stuff that's not worked out. And I was just really interested in doing some real work instead of some reporting work for a while, so. And what you are, so just be ready, be ready. What you are seeing on the screen is what we've been talking about. This, between Narasimha, Kartik and I, and Ellison has been in one or two of the discussions. This is around our beautiful boundary object of well-being. And the original thing that I wrote was meant to be a part of Ellison's review paper. It was in response to Ellison collecting all these indicators and me trying to figure out where they fit in all of these well-being framings that people have done throughout the years. If you're not aware, this is an enormous body of literature that people have approached in many disciplines and from many different ways. And if you want to be pointed to this body of literature, or if you have other things that you think we should consider and review, please speak up. Now, we have had some pretty focused and intense discussions to the point where, at least for me, my brain has stopped working last night, and maybe is a little bit back today for an hour or two, long enough to present. But what I wanted to do was share with everybody what we've been talking about. Some of you may have read the taxonomy write-up that was meant to be part of Ellison's paper. It then kind of exploded into its own thing to the point where it no longer fits in Ellison's paper. And Narasimha, Ellison, Adam, I know you've got some background in well-being as well. And so there's a bunch of people who have approached this. And so I wanted to share with the group what we've been doing so it becomes a group awareness rather than we've been working through it and we'll dump it on you at the last minute. And Narasimha, do you want to like talk through this sort of, I refuse to call it a framework. What is it called? What is it?
It's a theory.
Theory. It's a theory. Really? We got the theory?
Well, it's a conceptual approach. It's an approach.
Conceptual approach.
Well, so this is fundamentally trying to recreate or represent and then flesh out further the capabilities approach by Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. So yeah, approach, framework, whatever suits you. And so the idea was to start from the very top in terms of the end goal of all of this, which you can think about as, Amartya Sen would say freedom or self-actualization. And this is intended to be universal, by the way. applying to all the human condition. We start with the fundamental goal of human flourishing and just realize that this is not a shared view by everybody. You know, there's a utilitarian approach that may say that pleasure is the ultimate goal and maximizing pleasure. But this is kind of the starting Aristotelian ethics as kind of the founding father of this a little bit. Anyway, actualization and what is required for that, what do we do? Activities are our functionings. Different people may choose different functionings, but there are things we do. And what we do, we call them functionings in order to achieve actualization. Everybody's different, they choose different functionings, but that's the main activity that we represent in terms of the goal, to achieve the goal of actualization. In order to be able to function or carry out these different activities, there are perhaps capabilities we need, everybody needs, capabilities that allow us to pursue those functionings, which each of us will choose individually, based on our vision for our self-actualization. Now, these people who put forth this view, Nussbaum and Sen, were pushed a lot when they came up with this, to say, okay, what capability? Which one? Because they're numerous and people will choose their own. And so Martha Nussbaum came up with what he called central capabilities. They're intended to be things that people ought to have, they ought to be entitled to have, capabilities, no matter what other capabilities you may have, and regardless of what functionings you choose to pursue. People need to have things like adequate nutrition, respect and dignity, safety, free from coercion, things like that. There's a bunch of dimensions that are quite widely accepted. Amartya Sen did not correspondingly come up with central capabilities, but he did agree that there are a few things that would be universal and important to lay out, like food. Anyway, so among those, we were trying to then narrow down to something that we could use to pin our thinking on comfort, on indoor comfort. So we decided to let's just pick one. We could have picked others, bodily integrity being one of them. And in the literature, we tend to not see a lot of development of these individual dimensions. So we think that perhaps there's a gap in fleshing out comprehensively what having bodily integrity entails, or what does it mean to have it. And so we just threw out a few of them, and now we're thinking about the indoor residential domain for the most part. And so things like ability to breathe, lung function, freedom from violence, freedom from disease, some sense of comfort, which we are thinking about as a body temperature or some physiological property. So, and there could be many more that comprise bodily integrity. If you don't have these, your integrity will be compromised. And
Can I break in here? Because I think some people may not be familiar with how broad the dimensions of well-being or capabilities are.
Mhm.
So it might be good to give that a little bit of that background. So I've got those four. Oh, you can do it, Narasimha.
Oh, sorry, yeah, so I didn't define the broad categories that seem to be encapsulating of capabilities, of physical capabilities, social capabilities. This is our interaction in society and community and relationships, and a psychological component, which has to do with our minds and how we work. So having self-worth, having respect and dignity in society, those would be psychological. Physical would be good health, life expectancy, integrity of the body. Social would be things like being able to participate as a political entity, to be able to have successful relationships, to be loved, to give love. Those would be social. So those are very broadly encapsulating categories that I think are comprehensive and widely accepted. But within them, one can, yeah, you can list a whole number of capabilities, and the whole point is not all of these are important to everybody. But these central capabilities has a lot of gravitas as being a universal set. of a minima, kind of what's the minimum capabilities people ought to have.
And I think what, part of what we're responding to is when people talk about well-being or human actualization or whatever, there's these broad categories, and so people do one or two things. One, you have to like, oh, it's really complex. And then they never try to identify how you would approach it. Or they make a huge leap between, well, bodily integrity is one of the dimensions, and so we're going to measure temperature. And it's that huge leap that we're trying to fill in, because it seems like people who try to be comprehensive are never comprehensive, and you can't be, right? You can't measure or observe every single aspect in a study. And yet what came out for me from Ellison's review was that people would then just leap to like, we're going to be super comprehensive about well-being, and so we're going to look at productivity, right? And so how do you navigate through these really broad dimensions to things that you can measure?
Yeah. And so actually in the policy use of this was to leap to health and education. The health and education was seen as questioning the sole criterion of economic growth as a measure of progress of society. And the capabilities approach offered health and education as capabilities that everybody ought to have that are not measured by economic indicators. So that became the operationalization of the capabilities approach, widely used by the UNDP, right? Health and education. That's how they came up with the Human Development Index. They kept income, but they added health and education. But then there's like a humongous thousands and thousands and thousands of papers where they try to interpret the capabilities approach for any specific niche of intervention, like, oh, for energy access, or for, you know, some kind of food, or numerous things. Anyway, so this business of fleshing out capabilities comprehensively in particular domains may be a useful contribution, we think. So in the indoor residential domain, can we comprehensively flesh out the capabilities that are affected by everything we can think of that's physical in the indoor domain? Or conversely, if we start with particular capabilities that are important, what are all comprehensively the set of satisfiers in the physical domain that may influence that capability? That, in other words, we're trying to develop pathways, causal pathways from our physical world to well-being using this framework. So now moving from the properties of different capabilities, the next question is, what does it take to achieve those capabilities? And now we're getting into the physical world. And the term satisfier has been coined. Whatever, it's just a term that describes what is instrumental to achieving capabilities or basic needs. The basic needs literature, I will just add as a parenthesis right now, parallels the capabilities and tries to parallel the central capabilities as what is kind of universally essential. I won't say more about it because it's a huge debate as to what we really mean by basic needs, but I consider it parallel to this. So then the satisfiers are, what does it take to be comfortable, for a person to feel comfortable or objectively measure comfort? And now we start to list things that are a little bit more measurable, physical. So if we argue that body temperature or sensory comfort is an element of bodily integrity, we want to maintain that. It can be achieved by maintaining the outside the indoor ambient temperature at a certain, within a certain range, the humidity inside the house in a certain range, the ventilation in the house, but dependent on the clothes you wear, which also influence that sensory comfort, or it's a mediator of the environment, temperature and the humidity, etc. And then there's a hierarchy of satisfiers. And this is where you get into more and more detail when you try to operationalize things. So what achieves a particular ambient temperature in the house is your HVAC equipment, the quality of the building shell. And yeah, you can think of clothing as being part of that, or a prior level in the hierarchy, doesn't matter really. So once you get to this level, we start to now see things like heat pumps and interventions that influence these satisfiers, like a rebate for a heat pump, or a standard by ASHRAE for temperature in the indoor temperature, or relative humidity. And then now we then can look at interventions and trace them back to how they influence well-being. And there could be multiple pathways, right? So in some ways, the building shell also influences freedom from violence, right? Because it's the security of the home, or from the extreme elements of weather, for example, which also influence sensory comfort. So the building shell has many pathways to well-being, but now we have a way to trace them through different capabilities that they affect. In this quote unquote framework. Enough said?
I think so, and then I have down in the bottom the sort of steps, but maybe we want to pause here. So I think partly most of this is not new. The concept of capabilities obviously is throughout the literature for decades. The concept of satisfiers has been brought forward. I think what we're adding here is this intermediate sort of blue level saying the community should be able to define what it means to have bodily integrity, not to skip straight from the capability of bodily integrity to just measuring a temperature. So this provides a way to look at what are the components, have the community, like in a very, very long-term discussion, and probably an active and a discussion that contains many different viewpoints, what are the properties that cover the space of a single capability? So currently, people just pick an indicator and don't acknowledge what it is covering. So for example, people measure indoor air quality as a proxy for some kind of disease burden. And so they're saying that, okay, you need to have a air quality that does not make you sick, but they don't explicitly say that.
I do think also what's addition to what Tammy said, what's also maybe novel is in the indoor domain to comprehensively list satisfiers and link them to the pathways to capabilities. So even in Ellison's review, I believe that clothing is not really emphasized because the focus is on set point temperatures that affect ambient air, but they can be quite different if you have different preferences for clothing that you wear. We were talking about another example. We could do the same process for cooking and cook stoves. Fleshing out what capabilities do they affect. Obviously, bodily integrity in terms of preparing food, but there could be others because they affect air quality directly as well. And so if we were to flesh this out for a couple of different important domains of satisfiers in the home and trace them to well-being, they might do many things. They might help understand the power of interventions for affecting well-being and fleshing it out comprehensively. And allow us to compare the value of different interventions, for example, if they have multiple pathways of effect.
What do you mean by tracing well-being? Just tracing it upwards?
Yeah. Imagine we were able to sort of capture the extent, say, qualitatively of well-being.
What do you mean by well-being in this?
So how many capabilities you're affecting from, say, indoor air quality, and showing that it affects bodily integrity. It may affect social interactions if clothes are always smelling. I don't know.
So I have a comment on that. Let's let Adam speak.
Oh, yeah, sorry, apologies if this takes us a direction we shouldn't go, so feel free to skip my question. So in this conceptual framework, conceptual approach, we'll worry about that term later, is your we're trying to narrow our focus just to like the US or just a developed nation setting. The reason why I ask is that, you know, you get the example of cook stoves, and I think there's, you know, also work on like microgrids and capabilities. There are, I think, very powerful examples from the capabilities perspective of improved energy efficiency or just energy access in like an energy poor or energy insecure area or energy insecure you know, developing area. But it's a little bit, I think that it's a little more challenging to think through when we think of like homes in the US. Not saying that we can't, but you know, it's maybe the connections are less obvious, right? So I didn't know if that was what we were also trying to do, is that sort of thing. Does that make sense to sort of like pivot? Yeah, we know that if you install a microgrid, it improves literacy, which improves care, capabilities in some area of sub-Saharan Africa, let's say. But what does that same enhancement of capabilities look like in the US in terms of the indoor environment and energy usage and things like that?
I mean, to me, I think how I would, if I were to channel these theorists, that you would use the same framework outside in developing countries as in the US, but the intensity of different pathways might be different. You know, if you're focusing on biomass cook stoves, the indoor air quality becomes of paramount importance. You know, the standards here with LPG emissions are different. Focus maybe on something else. It partly is also comes down to culture, but also personal preference. And this whole theory leaves a lot of room for personal or cultural contingencies, because not everything is important to everybody or to the same level of intensity. That's what I would say.
Yeah, and I think that because of the group we're in right now, we used it to illustrate how one might think about the problem that we're looking at. But I think also we have talked about including the cook stove example from developing countries, since it's something that Ellison and Narsima and I are all familiar with, and maybe you too, Adam. And so I think I want to make a comment on what to use it for. I have a particular lens of what to use it for. I think that there's been a lot of papers that are like, look, it touches all these things. And so it must be really important. This domain must be really important because it has lots of influence. I see it a little bit differently. And I'm sure that if this gets published, people will use it for that purpose. But this came out of a response again to, or how I was looking at Ellison's results. And that is, given the complexity of the different aspects of well-being, what should one try to measure the most? Or what should one try to observe? So in the context of an intervention, if a property, so I go from the top down, if a property of a capability and then that can be observed in a satisfier is going to be affected by the intervention or affects it in terms of its context, the mechanism of how it works and is adopted, and the outcome in terms of well-being, like your temperature is lower or higher, then you should consider including that in your observation, survey, or study. And so I'm looking at it more from a, are you actually touching this aspect of well-being? And should you then assess it as either a driver or an outcome? So Ryan, I might defer your question to the next, like the next little bit on the preferences. I'm not really sure if that's the right thing to do.
It did raise a thought, though, if I may add here, that the question is, how useful are these things at the higher level, like demonstrating that it affects this capability and that capability? There are efforts to actually quantify and measure those impacts. So if you think about DALYs, disability adjusted life years lost. If you have persistent poor indoor air quality or persistent, extreme temperatures in the home, you can measure the effect on life expectancy or quality of life to some extent. There may be other measures, but I do think you can even be useful at the top level in some domains of quality. There are measures, some cases.
Ellison, did you want to chime in about? I don't know how connected you are right now, but. Or,
Should that?
yeah, well,
About
I don't know about anything.
okay, I didn't know there was something specific. Well, I think what my attention was drawn to, I feel like Narasimha, you answered this a bit, but I maybe share a little bit of like Adam's comment about US versus not US. I do understand you have a particular purpose for the cook stove thing, so I'm not trying to, I'm not even really bringing that particular thing up. I think I don't know. Sometimes it seems like a I don't know, almost foolish errand to try to come up with something that would apply across the globe. Like it seems unwieldy enough just to think about these things with respect to one country, but I can also understand why that's it's not even maybe that useful of a point. That's just what I keep thinking about. It's like, why do we have to make it apply to everybody across the world? But yeah, I don't know. Sorry, I don't have much to say. I don't have anything valuable.
Alison, do you mean us? Like, should we not, for the cook stove example, combine with the comfort example if we were to do this in a paper? Or do you mean you're complaining about the theory, the conceptual approach applying universally?
I think a cook stove example can be illustrative of something and be included in a paper that was just about the US. I think I just get caught up on, I don't know, I don't imagine a world where we have different well-being frameworks for different countries. That also seems silly. But trying to come up with some framework that applies universally over time across all types of people just seems like it makes it unnecessarily unwieldy to try to do that. But maybe that's part of the, scientific endeavor, or like what humans are trying to do is figure out how we work, and geopolitical boundaries are just some artifice. But yeah, the cook stove and comfort examples, I think those are more illustrative of applying a framework. I think I'm just more like reacting to Adam's comment about US based versus not, because it just seems like it becomes a lot more difficult to build up an argument that persists across countries that are different stages of development.
So I think the capabilities folks do tend to seek universal principles.
Yeah.
Right. And I would say as far down as capability properties, one could seek universal principles. And that's what I think should be a community-wide discussion. And by community-wide, I mean on the scale of global burden of disease or sustainable development goals. To have an entire community answering the question, what does it mean to have bodily integrity? Well, sensory comfort and freedom from disease are two examples, but come up with a short list of things that everyone agrees people should have. It does not define what comfort is. It does not address all the specific diseases, but what's listed there is currently only some examples that I would not feel qualified to flesh out or to propose. That is a decadal discussion. So the new idea is not, here are your buckets, people. It's, let's have some properties within capabilities, so we all agree of what a comprehensive notion is, which we do not have now. It also provides a stepping stone for people to begin to choose things to measure or indicators to address what they think is being satisfied and how that connects to overall well-being. So right now, imagine that whole light blue, or the part of the top of the screen, if you don't do colors well, imagine that's gone. And what we have now is bodily integrity, and I'm going to measure temperature and air pollution. And so it's that step is poorly defined. We're not proposing that we've filled out those bubbles yet. We're proposing that they should exist and be filled out. I can't read.
We should also add that I think a lot of literature review still needs to be done in the capabilities world, because these things would have been addressed, of course, to some extent in some sporadic way, but to characterize how this is novel and how to make it valuable and useful, I think remains to be seen a little bit. But I think there is value from what we know so far.
So Ryan's saying, why does that add value in a US context?
For me, at least, an improvement in capabilities is sort of a co-benefit of energy efficiency, right? That maybe we're thinking about things just in terms of cost savings or thermal comfort, but capabilities is another sort of non-monetary benefit of improving energy efficiency. It just may be, as Narasimhan, I think, noted earlier, that the intensity of the effect of, say, a weatherization improvement in a single-family home may not be as large as, a microgrid or transitioning away from cook stoves or something like that we've seen in more of a developing context. Maybe the effects just aren't as large as some of those other things.
I do think Ryan's, all of your pushback is valid. Like, how do we justify what is the value of using this approach in a framework that's currently dominated by utilitarian approaches and cost benefits? I mean, I think my initial reaction is that we're trying to capture things that cannot be monetized, and this allows us to do that. But definitely that requires more thinking.
I think my pushback there would be like these, like at this point, these things like seem like things that like we could monetize, like temperature, for example, that's easily monetizable based on how people set their thermostats. Humidity, I'm sure someone could work that out because an AC pulls out a common amount of humidity. Draftiness, I think like government already has monetized this if you read like clean energy plans. And so like I think if we're going to go this path, we need to have clear arguments about what is it unique that we haven't monetized here or can't be monetized. And I'm not sure that's clear yet.
So you've just given examples of the interventions, perhaps. I'm thinking of the impacts on humans, that some of which are monetized, like health impacts sometimes are monetized, some risks are monetized. But if you think about energy poverty and people trying to characterize like the persistent experience of operating outside a comfort zone that leads to psychological diminution of well-being, for example, right? Is often cited in the energy poverty literature, which ties into deeper questions of sense of entitlement to policies and things like that. Those would
Yeah.
be to me motivations, but I'm not saying they're strong enough. I'm just saying that those are the kinds of things that are fleshed out better in this framework than the utilitarian one.
I would agree with that. I think like to me, that's why it would be helpful to scope it as like we are really talking about energy insecure populations in the US. Because like most of the people in this call can probably address these things, but there are people and spend money to address these things, but there are people who aren't able to. And it adds value to me in that population. I'm not sure it does in the entire population, and maybe that's okay.
So I'm also seeing this, first of all, I acknowledge that I'm not in the policy world and I let policy people worry about what to do with things. But I do not see this as an alternative to cost benefit analysis or monetization. I think that, and again, this kind of response for me came up in reacting to some of the papers that Ellison and Zara turned up. And that was like, people recognize that there are unintended consequences, both positive and negative, or they call them co-benefits or whatever you want to call it, of conducting interventions, including energy transitions. And then they say, well, we need to think more holistically. It's not just about the transition, it's about well-being. And so using well-being as a framework to identify those elements that could be affected by an intervention or transition is a way to navigate a complex situation and give some guidance to people for what they should consider. It may be that at the end you measure and monetize all those things. That I don't think I don't see this as an alternative, like we're valuing things in terms of freedom or in terms of capability instead of money.
That's helpful. And like to be clear to your point, I've never seen comfort like monetized in a NREL CBA of an energy efficiency option. Like it's just not. So
I think for example, in incremental contribution in that space, like how we measure comfort, would simply be adaptive comfort that takes into, so that would be a contribution in the satisfier domain. Just thinking about what comfort really means, it's at the body level, not the room temperature level, and what the factors that influence it, for example.
I think now that I've had a little time to digest what's on the board, I guess I just wanted to say, kind of back to Tammy's earlier explanation of not proposing, I get the language wrong, not properties. What's the blue called?
Yeah, they're properties now.
Those are the okay, but
Yeah,
those
that's what I
bubbles,
was calling neat clusters, but they're not.
Okay.
We're gonna
Okay,
choose something new.
but those are what have not been made explicit often. And you're not saying what they should be, but rather that they should be there, and that should be something that emerges from community discussions, and community can be defined with a lot of different boundaries. Is that right?
Yeah.
No? Okay.
Yeah, that they should be there and people should talk about them.
Yeah. And so then that would allow like flexibility in terms of their weight or their presence at all, or what they're represented by. If I understand that right, that sounds, I like that flexibility.
Yeah, I think there's some tension in there, right? So for example, the housing quality versus housing access often comes up as a point of tension. And so,
Right.
but typically housing quality folks don't address access at all. Whereas
Right.
if it was somewhere as a bubble, then it would at least be made known.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, I myself, sorry.
No, go ahead.
in response to what you're saying, I mean, I myself have the tension as to what's the value of fleshing this out? Why? Like, why do we care? And I do think that requires a little more thought. I think about in the international domain, in the OECD, they have been more attuned to well-being earlier on than in the US. And there are a lot of reports I've seen where they've wanted to say, okay, this thing broadly affects well-being. And you'll see a table that looks at an intervention and just lists a bunch of bullet points. There are all these properties, and what else are you going to do with that except generate a fancy report showing there's 10 million things affected by this intervention. So I worry about that, because taking that to something that is operationalizable for policy, yeah, I care about policy. I mean, or even from a research perspective, what do you do with that? I'm myself struggling.
Yeah, because I'm not as focused on policy, I'm more like the poor people who did those things that Ellison reviewed. What would you tell them, right? Like you would tell them, oh no, well, right now it's like, well-being is really more complicated than you put. And they would say, well, what the heck? This is what I could measure. And so just some ideas about here are things to consider. Is this something that your study is addressing or your intervention is affecting? And even having people say, yes, it's possible that this intervention would affect the security of the house, but we did not address that. Even having people say that, I think would be useful
Right.
to bring forward potential co-benefits and unintended consequences.
Yes, I agree that making that explicit, even if it wasn't addressed, is valuable. It's been an argument that I know I've made explicitly in a few papers where we were assessing housing quality, just to your earlier point. And the journals that we sent it to were mostly people that treat housing as a social determinant of health, and were arguing that we didn't address access. And it allowed us the opportunity to say, well, we aren't addressing access. It is important, but once people can access housing, it just because they have access doesn't mean that the quality is guaranteed. And so we're focusing on quality. But making that argument was necessary to sort of convince the reviewers of what we were focused on and why it was, at least in our eyes, okay that access, we weren't evaluating housing access and its influence on health. Maybe to Narasimha's point, I think what you're setting up here a bit is an opportunity for like two-stage, like thinking about things in stages, maybe not two stages, but in order to talk about housing quality, you have to have a home.
Yeah.
Do we want to talk about subjective, or is that, it feels like a little bit too much right now? Yeah. Okay, well, that's what we're thinking about.
I think it's fair to say we need to flesh out why is this useful for policy? Why is this useful for researchers to better measure co-benefits and impacts, I guess, or even whatever else you're interested in research. I do think there's probably a positive concrete story that could be even more than what you and Ellison just said, that maybe it changes what you measure. You add a few things to measure when you really lay out what you're trying to study, and that leads you to a broader set of benefits or something.
Mhm.
Yeah, for me, that seems really intuitive, right? That you're the reason why we want to introduce capabilities is because there are far more benefits of, say, energy efficiency upgrades or, reducing energy insecurity than just the fact that people are a little bit more comfortable in their homes or something like that. I mean, sometimes it can almost seem a little bit trivial, like, couldn't they just put on a sweater? That there actually are, uh, you know, real improvements in human flourishing that can come with energy efficiency improvements, at least with some populations.
Well,
I
I
don't
think
know.
also, sorry,
Go for it.
go ahead, Ryan.
No, mine is a tangent. So
Well, so maybe to address the point about why would this even matter for high income US populations? If you don't find a driver that leads to well-being, that could be a reason why people aren't pushing for it. Because that's what people tend to pursue. So if your intervention touches none of these things, and nobody's inspired to do it, then you should not be surprised. And like, well, that sort of gets to the preferences bit that or the objective to subjective to preference bit, which is like people are going to take action on things that are important to them. And if it hasn't become important and is not affecting anything, then you might not expect it to have a driving mechanism for change. So the fact that it doesn't appear is also should raise some questions.
I think you should write that down as a third motivation, which is this framework may better help you understand the barriers to behavior change. Because it's some other dimension that's operating in people's minds stronger than the ones we conventionally focus on, which is energy costs and comfort level or temperature. But some other thing out of left field is driving decisions you don't know. And this may help you capture that.
Stacy sent, I don't know if everyone was on this, but a really well-written email about emergency changeouts and the role they have in this system. And I've been trying to use that as like a way of like looking at like all of the data I have again and see if there's anything there. And like, to me, there's this interesting role of like these 24-hour firms who like your AC breaks and they show up and have something fixed tomorrow. And when I pull like the cost of these installs, they're like incredibly higher and they're no better systems. Oftentimes they're actually worse systems. And so like there might be the subsets where it's like, yeah, some people make this as a rational decision. And other times it's like, we don't understand what's going on here. Why did they pay $50,000 to get a non-efficient furnace? And I actually think this might be really helpful if it's the middle of July and it's going to be really hot. Maybe that money doesn't matter at that point.
I don't think I received that. I'll go back through my email.
Yeah, I don't recall Stacy's email either.
Maybe I need to forward Stacy's email to everybody. It might have just been
I
to
sent
me.
it to- I know I sent it to Ryan. I might have copied Tammy. It wasn't to the whole group. But it could be shared.
Please.
I've been thinking through it, and I think there's something to your point. Like I think there's a different system there, and I've been trying to figure out how to get at it. I don't quite know how to do that, but I'm working on it.
Cool. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. Keep the thoughts coming.
I wanted to add one thing because I don't know if it's on the opposite side of satisfier or like opposite side of one of the capability properties. So the idea that energy codes introduces this idea, and then also utilities do. The idea that HVAC systems should be grid tied so that they could be controlled by the grid. So if we're talking about like bodily integrity, I feel like having the utility company tell me what temperature my house should be is like one of those limiters or something that takes away. And then an energy code, something that's also coming up is that like new systems should be grid tied, like they have extra points or something. Like if the system is grid tied and the utility program can control it, So I guess this introduces this question for me of like, are you willing to give up a little bit of bodily integrity so that the entire system doesn't go down with a rolling blackout or brownouts? Or as Ryan said, if someone pays me to participate in that program.
So I think this is outside the scope of this discussion,
Yes.
Stacy, but I've been elsewhere pursuing how self-determination and self-efficacy relate to decisions. And so that would come in another dimension, but you see this in like, nobody is taking my stove, right? They probably really don't care about the stove. What they care is being told what to do.
Right.
And so there's a group of people that will participate
Control.
because that is not that important to them. And there's a group of people to whom it is very important. Okay, well, wish y'all were here. We're having fun, and Kartik provided spicy Cheetos.
Ooh,
Have fun. Have a good trip.
thanks for the
Bye.
meeting. Yeah, bye-bye.
Thanks. Oh, Sapphire's today at 3. You don't have to come, but Paul's going to talk about HPC potential sessions.
Oh, sorry. That actually made me. Did anyone from the meeting? I had a meeting I couldn't go to Paul's session with the like better
Yeah.
building something. Did anyone attend that?
I
Half
was
of
on
it,
plane.
the back half.
Oh,
I would think it would be nice to get the recording. But I only caught the back half of the presentation, so I can't say I really heard anything new. But I know there was, like, I feel like I was catching the tail end of discussions that are overlapping with what we just talked about today.
So if that gets published somewhere, maybe I could follow up with Paul and find
Yeah.
out if the session is recorded and then post it. I couldn't attend. I had another meeting at that time. Okay.
Hey, thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Okay, bye.
bye.